To take this conversation even a step further, how does a nation exist if it doesn't have an informed citizenry? This was a question that Thomas Jefferson asked, and really laid out. You know, it was one of the reasons why he started the University of Virginia after he left the White House in 1809, and spent the next decade or so starting a free college, so that there would be an informed and educated electorate. It was the thing that in 1832 or 36, in the 1830s, when Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States from France and ended up writing Democracy in America, his kind of travelogue. The thing that he was so amazed about Americans is how well informed they were, that the average farmer knew about French politics. There was demand for news. Now, you could argue that in times of great change, there's demand for news, and people stepped in to meet that demand. There were a lot of newspapers, and they carried these stories. But the news was not regulated by the government. There was no demand that you actually had to produce news. There were newspapers that were just rags. There were newspapers that were propaganda pieces. There were newspapers, there were pro-slavery and anti-slavery newspapers. There were pro. I was going to say democracy, but it's such a shaky term. But there were basically the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists back then. What ultimately became the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, today called the Democratic Party, and then it became the Democratic Republicans, and it changed their name to the Democrats, and the Federalists died out, and they became the Whigs. But throughout that period of time, you had newspapers that were clearly in one camp or the other. Sort of like Fox News, clearly in one camp, MSNBC clearly in another. We survived. We figured out what was going on. So, on the one hand, I look at and I want to get Jeff Cohen on. I'm hoping he'll be available at the bottom of the hour. He wrote this book, Cable News Confidential, some years ago. He used to work at MSNBC, was on the air on MSNBC. Was the executive producer of the Phil Donahue show. In fact, he was here in our studio a couple of weeks ago with Phil Donahue. Actually, it was Norman Solomon who was with Phil Donahue. But in any case, Jeff and Norman were here in town. Had dinner with him, in fact, about a month ago. We had in the United States, from the 1930s until 1987, a requirement that news actually be news. It was not enforced much by the government. It was the industry was all about kind of self-regulation at that point in time. Those of you who are old enough to remember will know what I'm talking about when I lay this out. Those of you who aren't, hopefully you'll be enlightened by this. But from the 20s or the 30s, it was somewhere between 1927 and 1935, the Federal Communications Commission came into being. Originally, there was the Red Network and the Blue Network, and they ultimately became other things. And then TV came along in the 50s and 60s, and on it went. And the idea was, if you're using our airwaves, the airwaves are part of the commons. They're part of the public property. If you're using the airwaves to do anything, to play polka music, to play Father Coughlin's rants, these were the things that were big back in the 30s. To play country music, to play, fill in the blank. If you're using the public airwaves, the price you pay for that public bandwidth, which is regulated and administered by the government, by we the people, by the commons. And that, by the way, came into place in the 19-teens and 1920s out of necessity, because stations were just stepping all over each other, and somebody had to step in and say, okay, you have that bandwidth, you have this bandwidth, you can't interfere with each other, just make it a friendly place for consumers. The price that you paid was that you had to run news. You had to do what was called programming in the public interest. And there was this doctrine in the FCC called the Fairness Doctrine, which President Obama did away with last year, or this year, and which Ronald Reagan stopped enforcing in 1987. So it really hasn't been around since 87. And the Fairness Doctrine didn't say if you have an hour of liberals, you have to have an hour of conservatives. I know that, Rush Limbaugh would like you to believe that. It didn't say that. What it said was, if you want to have your license renewed every year, you have to prove your programming in the public interest. And the way that stations did this is they picked up news, typically from networks. And they ran it at the top of the hour, sometimes the top and the bottom of the hour. The TV stations ran it for an hour to start out prime time every night, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. And the networks lost money on this. But arguably, we were well informed. And having worked in news back in the 1970s, I can tell you, I could have been fired had I been seen talking to salespeople at the radio station I worked at. It was like there was this absolute firewall between revenue and news. That all changed in 87 when Reagan stopped the enforcement of the Fairness Doctrine. But we did fine for 150 years without the Fairness Doctrine. Or did we do fine? I mean, there are those who argue that William Randolph Hearst created the Spanish-American War by saying to Frederick Remington, give me the pictures and I'll give you the war. And Remington sent him the picture of the USS Maine on fire in Havana Harbor, and boom, we get the Spanish-American War.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 866-987-THOM.
So the question is really a huge one, and it's how do you have a functioning small d democracy when the news is not the news?